Welcome back to Session 2, Apportioning Costs. Hopefully you will have now worked through the DIY costing exercise for a few of your programs and started to be able to quickly recognise the direct, indirect and shadow costs of each, as well as further categorise those costs as either fixed or variable. Now we need to make sure that the dollar values that we attribute to those cost descriptions are a true and fair representative and equitable amongst all of our programs. Direct costs can be apportioned to programs through standard accounting and reporting procedures known as cost centres. However, indirect costs are more of a challenge, and in this session we'll work through strategies for apportioning our overhead costs across multiple programs. Most importantly, we'll be looking at slide 19, 20 and 21 within your PowerPoint presentation. So if we start by looking at slide 19, it gives us a few quick clues on how we can apportion our indirect costs. The most important thing here is that we actually have managerial and board agreement on how we are going to do this. So first we need to decide on that methodology on how we're going to apportion costs across all of our programs and ensure that that method that we use is actually applied consistently. As we start moving through the different methods that we can do, what we should also be doing is taking down any points or issues that we might identify in regards to that cost allocation. Because while at first we may consider that allocation is fair and equitable, we may actually realise after all of the costs have gone through the process and gone through our organisation for the first couple of months that this is not necessarily so. We need to be allowed to periodically review and assess the different apportioning of costs that we have agreed to, and at the same time decide whether or not that is the methodology we want to move forward with, or if it is a good time for us to trial another methodology. On the next slide, slide 20, you will actually see that there are 4 very clear and very straightforward methods that we can first start to consider. These are not necessarily the methods that you will end up with, but they are good, sound basis for any not-for-profit organisation to have a look at during that time. So the main methods of appropriating costs involve one or sometimes more of these methods, depending on what cost centres you are dividing. So for example, it could be the floor space occupied by each one of the programs for those organisations that are centre-based in regards to their structure and activity. It could be based on the annual revenues generated by each one of your programs, and in most cases this is where organisations will start. They will calculate our overall overhead costs and apportion those in a percentage point of view in accordance to the revenues that each one of our programs bring into the organisation. It can be also looked at from the number of staff or the number of staff hours attributed to each one of the programs. And to do this, we must actually start by understanding what true staff hours we put into each one of our programs. Because while we know what we might bill the government for, if we actually sit down with head hours and get our staff to fill in timesheets as accurately as they possibly can across all of the different programs that they may work on a day-to-day basis, we may be very surprised. We naturally want to spend more times on those programs that we like the most. And then there's also the number of client service hours. So the bigger the outputs required from each of the programs, the more overheads we may attribute to that. Again, there's no single method or standard in regards to apportioning costs within not-for-profit or even the commercial environment. What is most important is that we actually look at various of methods and work out what is the best for us. The bigger our organisation, the more programs we have, and the more complex our organisational structure, the more we need to look at clustering or categorizing our costs. And each section of costs may then be apportioned in a different way. For example, rent, telephone, IT and computers may all be cost together as administration and apportioned in one way, while our vehicles may actually be clustered in another cost centre and apportioned a different way. Once you are heading down the path of not only looking at your overhead costs as a whole, but actually categorising that then into administrative overheads, vehicle overheads, and different cost centres within those overhead costs, you are ready to move forward to the next stage of unit costing. The unit costing models are available through NDS and also through QCOS, and both provide excellent opportunities to go through a spreadsheet example and further apportion your overhead costs to service programs. And through this, you will end up with a unique and standalone unit price for each one of your programs. If you're planning to use either one of these models, we recommend that you not only do it for one, but you do it for multiple programs so that you can actually compare how each one of those sit in regards to the overall organisational cost structure. If we then now look at page 21, there is an example on how we can apportion costs such as rent. It's a very easy way to start. So in this example, we have two programs that are funded by government. We also have corporate services, so that is a user pay corporate service. And in total, we've got 20 staff. Overall, cover 100% of the floor space, and we also represent our annual revenues. Program 1, for example, has 4 staff, uses 10% of floor space because they're out and about in the community, and they have an annual revenue or income into the organisation of $100,000 or 25%. Program 2 is the big program for our organisation. It has 10 staff, it uses 60% of the floor space, and our annual revenue is $250,000 per year. And finally, our corporate services has 6 staff, 30% of floor space, and while it only attributes $50,000 per year into our annual revenues, it's very important because it also supports all of the overhead costs for Program 1 and Program 2. So the question here would be, how would you allocate the amount of rent of $5,000 per month to each one of those programs? And there's quite a few different scenarios. If we go back to our overall rule of thumb, we could do it by annual revenues. So whatever percent of annual revenues is the apportioned price of rent attributed to those programs. But in this case, we wonder whether or not that might be the fairest option. So for example, we've already said that corporate services does not only bring in its own revenues, but it actually supports Program 1 and Program 2 in regards to providing additional administrative and corporate support to the development and running of those programs. So in this case, we may choose not to put any rent at all into the corporate service, but simply to divide between Program 1 and Program 2. This is a great exercise to take to management and board meetings. It's very simple, but it actually really gives us insight into organisations and how we think and what we want to do in regards to allocating costs across our different programs. Again, very simple example, but it does come out with some really good outcomes in regards to, from an organisational point of view, what our preferred methodology is. So start with working with your methodology now, and now start also testing those theories and methods across multiple programs to see whether or not you come out with some favourable outcomes. And the quickest way to check whether or not an outcome is favourable is to compare the unit cost you have calculated with the price or the payment you receive. So before we wrap up Session 2, it's important to remember, test the methodology across a number of programs, test that it's fair and equitable across all of those programs. And most importantly, once a methodology has been proven, it should be approved and incorporated into your financial management policy for good corporate governance.